Well, it's been a few years since I looked in on what's been happening with Beyond Good and Evil 2. Maybe it's time to dive back in and... Oh no. Oh, Jesus, this is awful. Well, holy shit. I already knew for a long time that this game's development was a pretty stagnant pool of water, but at first glance I could never have predicted the sheer volume of algae and mosquito eggs and dead fish that it has drifting around inside it. For those of you who only started watching this channel recently, you might think that the only reason I'm on YouTube is to have contrarian opinions about Zelda games. In fact, this only accounts for roughly 73% of my videos, and it's not where I started off at all. My very first video was a response to Ubisoft's 2017 trailer for Beyond Good and Evil 2, and for the entire 7 years of this channel I've been paying attention on and off, mostly off, to how this particular game project has been going. That's a long time to be tracking a single game, but it doesn't even account for half of the 15 years that it's been in development, which makes Beyond Good and Evil 2 officially the game that has taken the longest time to release since its initial announcement, even more than the legendarily sluggish Duke Nukem Forever. Even back in 2017, though, things weren't looking too good. Ironically, because the trailer looked really good. You might think that a beautiful pre-rendered trailer full of humor and outlandish visuals would be a sign that a studio had a lot of creative ideas, as well as the cash needed to make a quality product. That's certainly the message they intended to send. But anyone who'd been watching video game trailers for the past few years could tell you that, if anything, this exact kind of trailer tended to be attached to game projects with no clear direction or major gameplay hook. The 2011 horror game Dead Island, for example, had an amazing, touchingly directed trailer that really sold the tragedy and horror of a family being caught up in a zombie outbreak. It was eloquent, it was gripping, and it was almost completely unlike the game that it was ostensibly based on, which ended up as an excuse to wade through hundreds of unremarkable, repetitive zombie fights. It was like a zombie-themed MMO, but without the possibility of social interaction. Or a first-person version of Dead Rising 2, with a tenth of that game's personality, gameplay variety, and fun. If you wanted to play a game that resembled the Dead Island trailer to any significant extent, you were going to have to wait 2 years for the release of The Last of Us, a game which really did manage to immerse players in the struggles, both physical and emotional, of a man and his adopted little girl trying to survive in a post-zombie environment. And did The Last of Us have one of these fancy-schmancy pre-rendered trailers? Not at all. To promote the game, Naughty Dog presented a mock-up of the game actually running on a PlayStation 3, letting the audience see not some idealized vision of what the game might be about, but a realized demonstration of the product they were actually working on. In that trailer, you had gameplay, you had level structure, and yeah, you had story too, but story in the context of its associated gameplay, which makes a world of difference in terms of, well, honesty. In the same year that Dead Island released, there was another pre-rendered video game trailer which received a lot of praise for its art direction and offbeat sense of humor. Overstrike, a game that was being developed by the same people who made the Ratchet & Clank series. That trailer was 2.5 minutes of non-stop fun, and unlike the Dead Island trailer, it actually gave the viewer a lot of ideas about what it would be like to play the game when it eventually came out. Judging the trailer either as a way to stir up interest in the game, or as a work of art in its own right, it was a fantastic success. However, it would also end up being just as much of a lie, and an annoyance to its target audience, as the Dead Island trailer was. Focus testing and some ill-advised pivots away from the concept's initial quirkiness mutated Overstrike into something very different from what had originally been promised, and when the game, now retitled Fuse, ultimately came out in 2013, the nicest word that anyone used to describe it was polished. Far more common were descriptors such as tired, bland, and forgettable. It's not so much the fact that these two games had pre-rendered trailers that made their marketing seem deceptive, as the fact that these trailers were promoted so heavily, and that the developers barely provided anything else to show the public what these games were like before their eventual release. While neither project could reasonably be described as vaporware, both of them shared a critical thread in common with the stereotypical vaporware project: secrecy. And the 2017 E3 trailer for Beyond Good and Evil 2 fell neatly into this same pattern of artsy and exciting but basically uninformative content. This was what marketing types generally refer to as a teaser, something breezy and insubstantial that you put out not to discuss the product yourself, but to get other people talking about it. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in any absolute sense, but in the same way that sugary cereal is only part of a balanced breakfast, teaser trailers do not constitute a proper ad campaign on their own. If you put out nothing but teaser trailers, the audience will start to make assumptions based on them, in the absence of anything more concrete. But because teasers tend to play fast and loose with details, these assumptions will often be wrong, leading to extreme disappointment when the finished product falls short. Of course, this is all a moot point if your customers don't have anything to be disappointed with because your game never comes out in the first place. The buzz about Dead Island began in early 2011 and ended when the game released in late 2011. Overstrike's teaser trailer came out the same year, and the eventual dud that was Fuse was on store shelves by mid-2013. Meanwhile, Beyond Good and Evil 2 has been in development for 15 years, with no signs of progress for most of them, including the last 5. To say that there's been a lot of water under the bridge since the game was first announced would be an understatement. Beyond Good and Evil 2 was announced at the end of George W. Bush's second presidential term. Just coming onto the musical scene were such hot new artists as Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, and the Jonas Brothers. The original iPhone was a year old. The platform I'm using to tell you this was 3 years old, and its management still thought Rickrolling was a hilarious idea for an April Fool's joke. I mean, I still think it's hilarious, but seriously, Rickrolling? That's old, man. Look specifically at video games, and the difference between then and now is just as stark. The idea of Beyond Good and Evil 2 is older than the original Dark Souls. When it was announced, Angry Birds and Minecraft didn't exist yet. The big cross-platform games from that year were Grand Theft Auto 4 and Metal Gear Solid 4. It would take 3 more years for Ubisoft to revive the Rayman series, only to kill it off 3 years after that due to low sales. Nintendo would go from dominating the console market to totally humiliating itself, and then shoot back to the top again over the course of 3 hardware generations. This is a long freaking time to spend not finishing a game project. Even Ubisoft itself seems a little thrown by the enormous quantity of time that this project has taken up. Their last blog post related to the Space Monkey program for fans and contributors to the game was in mid-2020. The forums, which once contained information and fan discussions about the game, were ignominiously shut down last year, with no archives set up to preserve the information they contained. Most bizarrely, the game's official website contains a poll asking which platform people would prefer to play the game on: PC, PlayStation 4, or Xbox One. So, in case you've forgotten, the PlayStation 5 was announced in mid-2019, and the Xbox Series X in 2020. By the end of 2020, both of these consoles were available for purchase. So this poll is now more than 4 years out of date, but it's still up there, as if literally no one at Ubisoft has even looked at their own website in that entire 4-year period. I would call this horrendous marketing, except that would kind of imply that they care whether anyone wants to buy this game or not, and I'm not convinced that they do. It's so absurd, it's hysterical. But not everything about this situation is funny. One of the other things that's happened since the last time I talked about Beyond Good and Evil 2 is the loss of its creative director, Emile Morel, about a year ago. And I don't mean he's lost to the project, like Michel Ancel. I mean he actually passed away at the age of 40. Morel had only recently taken over the project after another creative lead had abandoned ship, but he was by no means an inexperienced newbie. He cut his teeth designing the 2008 Alone in the Dark reboot for Eden Studios, and also happened to be the lead designer for Rayman Legends, a game that I love. He had a lot of potential and seems to have been liked by practically everybody, and it was horrible to see his career end like this. It would be ridiculous to blame the delays in Beyond Good and Evil 2's production for his tragic and premature death, and I'm not going to go near doing that. But what I will say is that if the team had just knuckled down and finished this stupid game project in a mere 10 years instead of 15, he would at least have been able to see something tangible emerge from all that stress and hard work, and now that's never going to happen. This has all gotten so complicated. So many years gone by, so many implicit promises broken, so much wasted potential. I wish I could just get a clear, simple idea of what all this has been about. What is Beyond Good and Evil 2 when you get right down to it? For that matter, what is Beyond Good and Evil when you get right down to it? Well, it's an action-adventure game from 2003, made by the guy who was known at that time, if he was known at all, for making Rayman back in 1995, which was the best-selling game Michel Ancel worked on until Rayman Legends barely surpassed it in the late 2010s. Was it innovative? Not really. In terms of gameplay, I wouldn't even say it was as revolutionary for its time as the original Rayman was for the mid-90s. It had a lot of interesting mechanics in it, but every single one was something that other games had done before and better. Even the idea of putting them all together in one game wasn't new. The sequel to Jak and Daxter, creatively titled Jak 2, shares a lot of design DNA in common with Beyond Good and Evil. I mean a lot, and it made it out the door a month earlier. Beyond Good and Evil had a pretty good story, at least in terms of the setting and characters and broad concepts. But the weakest part of it was the plotting, the actual progression from one plot point to another. So if you happen to not click with the characters or the overall style, it starts to feel really boring. Now, to be fair, this is also something the game shares in common with the likes of Jak 2 and other sandboxy experiences like Grand Theft Auto. But those games came out first, and I believe, sucked up most of the interest that people had in this kind of thing. Being first at anything in the video game world, even if it's not that mind-blowing a concept, gives you a major advantage against other studios that are trying to do the same thing, which is something Ubisoft really should have learned by now after being wrong-footed by it so many times. Beyond Good and Evil wasn't a ripoff, but I remember the way people reacted to it back then, and a lot of them treated it like one. Kind of like what happened to Bait and Kados a few years later, actually. So what does that leave us with? Style and aesthetics, basically, which were not the kind of things people were paying a lot of attention to in the heady, technologically volcanic days of the early 2000s. I can look back at this game and appreciate its brilliant soundtrack and funny NPCs and the obvious affection that was lavished on its fictional world. Maybe you can too. But players at the time, as well as most critics, just couldn't. They were laser-focused on the gameplay, and the gameplay is frankly just average in terms of fun and challenge. And this brings us to a more enduring problem. As a game that didn't excel at anything other than style, how was Beyond Good and Evil supposed to serve as a jumping-off point for a sequel? Sequels generally justify their existence, artistically at least, in one of two ways, either by continuing and expanding on the story of the first game, or by expanding on the gameplay of the first game. Halo 2 is a good example of doing the former. Half-Life 2 is a good example of doing the latter. You can certainly do both, but it's risky, and generally disappointing, to do neither. Beyond Good and Evil couldn't expand in the gameplay direction because it wasn't focused enough to have any obvious areas to build on. Adding more new gameplay mechanics would probably make it feel incoherent, but stripping away existing mechanics in order to expand what was left would make it feel insubstantial. Sequels are supposed to be bigger than the original, not more restrained. Okay, so we keep the gameplay of the sequel really similar and just continue the story, right? That works. Except it really doesn't, because despite all the potential inherent in the world of Hillis, the story at the end of Beyond Good and Evil had nowhere to go. The threat of the DOMs just kind of fizzles out, temporarily if the sequel hook is to be taken seriously, but apart from the mystery of Jade's origins, which is only lightly hinted at over the course of the game's story, there isn't anything for a sequel to build on. Compared with gameplay sequels and story sequels, a style sequel is about the most difficult kind to pull off. And I don't just mean the least likely to succeed financially, I mean it's difficult to even know where to start with it. Admittedly, Michel Ancel had already managed this once before with Rayman 2, which isn't really a sequel to Rayman, so much as a complete reimagining with just a few elements carried over. But that didn't feel so jarring because neither of these games was strongly story-focused. They're both goofy platformers with a heavy emphasis on individual level gimmicks. Beyond Good and Evil is so much more complicated than that, whether you're talking about the mechanics or the story. Despite Ancel's claims that he planned the game as the first entry in a trilogy, it doesn't come across as the start of anything bigger. It feels more like a one-off that had a few too many ideas included for its own good, without any of them constituting an obvious starting point for a sequel. So can we really be surprised that after all this time it still doesn't have one? Not being able to focus on a set of core design principles isn't a problem that emerged during the development of Beyond Good and Evil 2. It's a fundamental issue with the franchise that was there from the very beginning. The fact that the original got made at all was a minor miracle under the circumstances. It was lightning in a bottle, and lightning doesn't strike the same bottle twice. Duke Nukem Forever is the only game project that's comparable to Beyond Good and Evil 2 for sheer lack of progress over such an astonishing length of time. But the truth is that Beyond Good and Evil 2 isn't much like Duke Nukem Forever. There was no megalomaniac studio head refusing to accept anything less than the perfect game, no Cold War between the studio and an exasperated publisher, leading to recriminations and lawsuits, no constant engine changes to keep up with an ever-shifting cutting edge of graphics technology. Much as I hate saying this, Duke Nukem Forever had an excuse for taking forever to come out, and Beyond Good and Evil 2 doesn't. This game really should have been out already if Ubisoft had any serious intention of developing it, and that leads to the upsetting conclusion that they don't, and never did. This is vaporware to an extent that Duke Nukem Forever could only dream of, something more in the vein of Half-Life 3, which is a game that everyone with any brains at all knows is not going to come out. You might ask why they would do this. Why are they still insisting that Beyond Good and Evil 2 is on the way, when all the evidence suggests that this is cheap talk? In the long run, it can't do their reputation any good to be associated with the most infamous case of vaporware still on the books. While Michel Ancel was still at Ubisoft, this did make a certain amount of sense. He clearly wanted Beyond Good and Evil 2 to become a reality, and inside Ubisoft, he may have been the only high-level guy who did. It seems like the kind of thing he would fall back on when he wasn't working on something else. In 2008, when the last game he had major involvement with was 3 years in the past, he nudged them into creating that first teaser trailer. Then he got involved in the Rayman reboot series, and Beyond Good and Evil 2 went on the back burner. That series ended in 2014, and 3 years later, like clockwork, there's a new spiffy E3 trailer for Beyond Good and Evil 2. But Michel Ancel is gone now. Guillaume Carmona, who took over for him, is gone. The original creative director, Jean-Marc Geoffroy, is gone. Emile Morel, who replaced him, is really gone. This project is burning through top-level creative staff like a blowtorch through a bottle of olive oil. After 15 years, nobody has any idea what the game is going to be like other than wacky, and the few people who were speculating about it have had their conversations sucked down the memory hole, never to be referred to again. It's not just that I think they aren't making Beyond Good and Evil 2. At this point, I don't think they should. This project is a horrible shaggy dog story with no punchline, and the longer it goes on, the bleaker and more depressing it gets. I don't want to be here in 2030 telling you about how 3 more creative directors have left the team, but it's okay because they made another teaser trailer, not at E3 of course, since that's another thing that died while this game was in progress, where some cyborg shark person with dreadlocks is riding a jet ski, and he looks up at the clouds and there's one that's shaped like Paige. Just end the charade, Ubisoft. We all know that you're capable of making video games when you really want to, even long-delayed and crappy ones like Skull and Bones. To call your dedication to Beyond Good and Evil 2 perfunctory would be an insult to thousands of hardworking perfuncts. Your explanations for why the game isn't finished are as threadbare as the top of Yves Guillemot's head. And even the people who want this game to come out are so sick of the bullshit that I think they would breathe a sigh of relief if they heard the whole thing was cancelled. Would that be a sad and pathetic way to end the story of this game's development? Yes, it would. But so would just about anything else at this point. And with every year that you dither and try to have it both ways, you are just doubling down on the disappointment. Look at it this way. If you tell everyone that Beyond Good and Evil 2 isn't coming out, and then in a few years someone has an amazing idea for it and you leap back into making it, that would be great. It would be a wonderful, out-of-left-field surprise. But when you tell people that it is coming out, and it never does, that's obnoxious, and it makes you look like a liar. Which is what you are, let's face it, Ubisoft. And if you want to skid to a halt before you end up being known as the biggest liar in video game history, you should heed my words and announce that this game is cancelled. Or release a playable demo where you play as Paige. That would also help. Maybe then I can finally let go of the pain and frustration that caused me to make that first video 7 years ago, and get back to what this channel is supposed to be all about. Complaining about Zelda games. Hell yeah!